While we go through this video, you're going to need to have your reader's notebook or a piece of paper or some Post-its to jot down some notes as we go through this lesson. Please make sure you have the date on this page, and you're going to use this information to prepare yourself for tomorrow's small group discussions on our Zoom call. So today we're going to be talking about and understanding a little bit more about why John Boyne might have decided to write this story, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, and call it a fable. So we know that it is historical fiction, but it is more specifically a fable. So what is a fable? A fable is a short story that typically has animals as characters that tells a moral. Now we know that The Boy in the Striped Pajamas does not have animals as their characters, but we have talked a little bit about these characters representing something more than just the one character. So instead of them being animals, they represent an entire group of people, a stereotype or an archetype. So for example, Bruno represents the innocence or the ignorance of the Germans during the Holocaust. He is a typical German boy, and his father is a Nazi, yet he knows nothing about what's going on because he chooses to not understand or hide himself from the terrible things that are happening around him. And his parents don't make it much easier. So he represents those people that were ignorant of what Nazis were doing during the Holocaust. Gretel, we talked about representing those people who were persuaded by propaganda. We can also consider Father a representative of the Nazi soldiers as order followers. If you took the time to watch any of your classmates' presentations about the Nuremberg trials, a lot of the Nazi soldiers and Nazi officers that were tried, or the ones that were arrested, claimed that they were only following orders and it wasn't their fault, the things that they were doing. So Father is supposed to represent those types of people. Mother, on the other hand, represents the women, the mothers and wives mostly, who were left in the dark. They were not supposed to know what was going on, even as Bruno's mother knows. They were not supposed to know what was going on, even when they were right next to the concentration camps that were murdering millions of people. So she's supposed to represent those types of people who are just kind of complacent and happy with their husband or their son, or any man in their life that gained something from the Nazis. And Mother does that. And we see that when she tells grandmother that she's very proud of the way that her husband's uniform looks rather than what he does. Now, the other part of Fable, actually, before we get to the other part of the fable, let's consider these other characters. Who might Shmuel represent? Yes, we know he is a concentration camp prisoner. Who else might he represent more specifically? Lieutenant Kotler, what does he represent? We know that he is a Nazi soldier, but what more specifically might he represent in Nazi soldiers? Who does Pavel represent? He's also a concentration camp prisoner, but he represents something different than Shmuel does. And what maybe does Maria represent? Maria, Bruno's maid. Now the other side of this is the aspect of telling a moral. We know fables tell a moral. And in this case, we want to consider some of the things that we might have learned. So some of the conflicts from the story. Bruno befriending Shmuel, even though he's not supposed to be exploring near the fence. So his parents set the rule that he's not allowed to go back there. Yet he does anyway. He makes friends with Shmuel, someone who he knows his parents wouldn't want him to be friends with. And as a result, he dies in a concentration camp gas chamber by not following the rules. In the same way, Bruno doesn't understand the purpose of the fence or the camp for that matter. So again, he dies in a gas chamber. If he had understood what was going on, he may not have even done either of those things, which may have changed the ending of the book. Another conflict that we have is that Father follows orders even though his wife and mother disagree with those orders. His mother doesn't like what he stands for. She knows that what the Nazis are doing, and she tells him so. And she tells him she is so disappointed in what he's doing. Mother, on the other hand, tells him that she doesn't like the idea of them moving next to the concentration camp Auschwitz. Now, she doesn't know 100% what's going on, but she does know that she doesn't like the idea of moving there. As a result of him being such a rule follower and the two women in his life disagreeing with what he's doing, his son is a victim of his own orders. He orders the soldiers at the camp to kill the prisoners, and his son becomes a victim of those murders. Another thing that we need to consider in this is the final idea that John Boyne leaves us with. The final lines really make it sound like a fable. He says, and that's the end of the story about Bruno and his family. Of course, all this happened a long time ago, and nothing like that could ever happen again. Not in this day and age. And we know that John Boyne isn't an idiot. We know that he knows that this is something that could totally happen again. He's saying this in a way to try to teach us something, and he's being a little cheeky about it. He's being a little sarcastic, maybe, or ironic, we might say. So in that case, we have to consider what these lines might be telling us about the fable overall. Now, this is a review by Richard Schickel, we can say, from Time Magazine of the Boy in the Striped Pajamas movie. But what he's really criticizing here is the story. It's not necessarily something specific to the movie. It definitely is about the story overall. So what the title of his review is, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, A Failed Holocaust Fable. Now, we want to pay attention to what he's saying is failing about this movie, about this story. And we want to consider, is it a failed Holocaust fable or is it not a failed Holocaust fable? Okay, so this was a review of the movie after it came out in 2008. When the full extent of the Holocaust became generally known after the end of World War II, the thought that its horror was too monstrous to write about in the conventional fictional forms slipped into the conversations of literary intellectuals. Fiction implies maneuver, heroic activity, moral preachment, even softening sentiment, all of which gestures seem trivial and inappropriate in the context of unprecedented and, in some sense, inexplicable evil. Putting the point simply, it is impossible to think of a novel, play, or film that conveys the full effect of the Nazi genocide. The works that abide, Anne Frank's diary, Primo Levi's recollections of the death camps, Schindler's List, are all starkly factual. And their looming presence in our minds renders a movie like The Boy in the Striped Pajamas ludicrous. It concerns an 8-year-old boy named Bruno, whose career soldier father is placed in command of a concentration camp early in the war. The child is unaware of the camp's function. He thinks it is some kind of farm. All he knows is that he has no friends and no worthwhile activities to divert him. He isn't even allowed to go to school. He and his sister are tutored at home by a Nazi functionary, while their mother ditheringly denies what she must know is taking place in the camp. Eventually, Bruno wanders through the woods, encounters the barbed wire and Shmuel, an inmate of his own age. He wonders why the boy always wears pajamas, actually, of course, the striped prisoner's uniform. Thinks perhaps the numbers on his garb are part of some fun game his pal is playing. His misapprehension is reinforced by a movie about camp life his father has produced, showing its inmates singing and dancing and repairing to a cafe for light refreshment after the day's work is done. Now, this is something that doesn't happen in the book. Bruno does not see a movie about the camp that his father created. In the movie, I think they do that to support the idea that Bruno really doesn't understand because people are lying to him. But essentially what happens is Bruno happens to see his father showing a movie, propaganda movie, that shows what the Nazis would like people to believe are happening in the camps, that they're just bringing all of the Jews to live in one place, and they're totally safe and they're being treated well, and they have cafes to go to eat, and when the day's work is done, they're happy and they're in good spirits. Now that definitely is propaganda. So that's just another thing that kind of supports why Bruno doesn't understand what's going on. But that we know that's not in the book. Striped Pajamas, written and directed by Mark Herman, requires everyone in it to remain unconscious to every clue, and there are many, about what is happening in the family's backyard. Even when the gas chambers are fired up, smoke blackening the sky and stench filling their nostrils, they insist the camp is just burning some old clothes. The largest silence is Shmuel's, who never forthrightly explains his desperate circumstances to Bruno. Maybe he doesn't want to shock his new friend. More likely, his true imprisonment is in the desperate manipulations of this movie, its need to keep everyone in a state of ignorance or denial until Shmuel sneaks Bruno into the camp and toward a supposedly suspenseful, potentially tragic, but totally improbable ending. What other aspects of this book, this story, seem improbable or unlikely to have actually happened in real life? There are definitely quite a few places that seem very unlikely and unrealistic. Finally, at the end of the review, the critic says, "I don't think I've seen, at least since equally offensive concentration camp Fable, Life is Beautiful, a movie so reliant on human stupidity to achieve its effect, so totally dishonest in its insistence on that quality, which it presents as innocence, to achieve its narrative goals. Bruno and Shmuel may be only 8 years old, but that is well past the age of reason, and they're caught up in situations that would force anyone to acquire a shrewdness or intelligence well in advance of their years. I don't know if a movie as simple-minded and emotionally shameless as this one definitively proves that fiction is not a suitable vehicle for the consideration of crimes as vast as the Holocaust, but it will do until the next historical travesty comes along." Now, finally, what you really need to consider in your preparation for tomorrow, for our discussion, you need to have something prepared. So you need to have something written down that you're going to share, whether it be a question or an answer to one of these questions. So you see, number one, do you agree or disagree with the critic's review that The Boy in the Striped Pajamas is a failed Holocaust fable, and why? So you want to consider what the critic says is not very good about this book, about this story. And you also want to consider what makes a fable. So you're going to say whether you agree or disagree and why. Okay, it's not enough to say, "I agree that it is a failed fable." You have to tell us why you think it is and give some examples. Another thing you might consider, why might some people consider it disrespectful to write about the Holocaust in a fictional way? In the beginning of the article, the critic says that it's always very questionable. Some of the best Holocaust writings are actually those that are factual, like Anne Frank's diary and Primo Levi's accounts, as well as the memoirs by Elie Wiesel. So why might some people think it's disrespectful to write about the Holocaust in fiction, to make things up? The third question asks, what was John Boyden's purpose for deciding to write a fable about the Holocaust in this way? What was his purpose? Do you think he was successful? So I want you to keep in mind, and this is something else that you should probably consider, John Boyne wrote this story in about 2.5 days. So it wasn't something that he spent months and months researching. He wrote it in 2.5 days, and the story was essentially done. He was just going through revising and editing after that. So what was his purpose for deciding to write this fable? And do you think he was successful? And then another thing that you might bring up in our discussion tomorrow might be some questions that you still have, questions about purposes or questions about what some things mean. But you want to bring something to the table that allows us to further our discussion. If you need to go back into the reading And in the read aloud of this article, you absolutely may. You can go back and look at the different aspects of what makes a fable. That would be a really good idea to prepare for tomorrow. I'm also going to post a link to the article from Time Magazine from time.com, so you can take a look at it yourself if you need to.